Let's say I find a girl that I want to marry. Now, here's what I won't do. I won't go talk to her. Because if you talk to her, we'll both lose face. We'll lose honor in the society. So I will go, and let's say I find, Mike, you've got this daughter. She's gorgeous. I want to marry your daughter. Here's how I'll do it. First of all, how do I know she's gorgeous? Since she's mostly covered most of the time whenever she's in public. I talk to her brother. That's how you get information. Second, I would never talk to her. I would go to Mike and I would say, Mike, your daughter is so ugly, she will scare the wool off my sheep.
And I would say, but you're so mistaken, my son.
You are so mistaken. No, she's very beautiful. And we would begin to negotiate. I start low, he starts high. You know how this works. Now, I'm not buying a wife. A good wife who can find. She's more precious than gems. I'm not buying one because I can't afford one. What I'm doing is determining the level of compensation that has to go to his family for the removal of his daughter. And we would agree on something. Now, if he agrees on this amount, the daughter's out in the field, let's say, and the son runs out and says, I think the guy that wants to marry you is here. So what happens is, she'll come in, she'll start pinching her face, try to get a little color in it, brush out the hair and, whatever. And she'll come in and she'll meet me. Shalom, I'm Dr. Randall Smith from Christian Travel Study Programs, and we are looking forward to spending some more time with you and exploring the lands of the Bible. I've been traveling the region of the Mediterranean. Here I am by the Aegean Sea on the island of Mykonos in Greece. But I've been traveling for 35 years, trying to expose and show people the context of the biblical narrative. For these last couple of decades, we've been making these videos site by site, trying to expose who was Jesus, who were the people that followed him, what happened as a result of the gospel message as it left a small group of men huddled on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee, all the way out into the regions of Rome and Greece and the spread of the gospel message. Thanks for joining us for this series of Exploring the Lands of the Bible. Each one of our sites will be picked up in this series as we try to expose the background. And we're hoping that you will learn more and that the Bible will be more deeply meaningful to you. Even if you can't come on the tour, at least you can experience some of what we do as we make the journey together. Thanks for joining us in Exploring the Lands of the Bible. Well, today, I'm standing here in the Aegean Sea, next to the ruins of an old Byzantine church. But I doubt that when Jesus was preaching in the small town of Capernaum, anybody thought that the message of a Nazarene rabbi standing in Capernaum would travel all around the Roman world. But it did. Today, we'd like to take you into Capernaum, look at its ancient streets, some of its ancient houses, and pick out some of the stories of one of the most exciting places that Jesus spent time. Welcome to Exploring the Lands of the Bible in Capernaum. So we're going to take a look at Capernaum. Now, why is it important? Obviously, from what we find at Capernaum, the people work in two main areas of vocation. Now, they may do other things, but this is the evidence we have. In the 10-acre site, we have more millstones per square meter than any other site in the country. which means either these people are the most hungry people on the face of the earth, or they're shipping them to other places. And we have in the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem one that looks like it came from the tooling that you have from Capernaum. So it looks like they have a FedEx ox cart business of sending big, heavy stones, cut stones to other places for millstones, industrial size and house size. The second one is obviously fishing. So the Zebedee and Sons Fishing Company Incorporated, although they were begun in Bethsaida, they moved apparently and located at Capernaum at the time of the Gospels. They have pieces of 8 homes, insula-style homes, a synagogue, and one home that was changed into a domus ecclesia, a house church, that became a ceremonial church, meaning an octagonal church like was familiar to the 5th and 6th centuries. And as we make our way around, you're going to see that there's a mixture of geologies here. There's basalt and the black rocks, and there's also hard limestone. But the black rocks have overtaken these hillsides. In the Gospels, the term wilderness place means unbuildable place. It doesn't mean there's like a pine forest. So a wilderness place can just be a rocky hill in which you can't build things. Now today we can, because we have John Deere. They didn't have John Deere. So we can pick it up and move it. So as we make our way around toward the north shore of the Sea of Galilee, I'm going to take you over to Capernaum. But on our way, we're going to discover that there are some big, broad valleys. They're leading into or washing water into the north shore of the Sea of Galilee, but they're actually fan valleys that have natural theater shapes. And so we're going to see several of those on our way. The Gospels don't tell us how many people are listening to Jesus. They only tell us how many people he fed on at least 2 occasions. Okay? But it's interesting to note, by looking at these theater-shaped valleys, we can surmise how many people could have heard him. Now, directly now behind me, there's an open area. And in 1970 and 71, a company by the name of Bolt, Baranek, and Newman. It's an audio company from New York City, a Jewish company. They came here and in 1971 brought the wireless FM microphone. How shocking, such new technology. And they set them out all around the inside of this valley. And what they were doing was trying to determine how many people could hear someone speaking unamplified into the valley. And they determined as many as 5,000 to 5,500 people could hear an unamplified voice if it's the afternoon before the winds blow. So we think Jesus taught in the morning. The fishermen fished all night because the water most of the year is clear and the fish aren't stupid. So that you do it at night. And then in the morning, the problem is they were using linen nets. Linen loses its tensile strength when it gets wet, and it will cause the nets to be wounded by their work. And you'll have to mend those nets frequently. This is before the advent of nylon, which doesn't do that. And so as a result, every morning, early morning, as the sun is rising, men are coming in with the fish. They're bringing the fish to the market, and then they're hanging their nets and stitching closed all the breaks in the nets. Jesus would teach early in the morning. How do we know that? Because you can fry an egg on a rock in the summertime by midday out here. No one listens to a teacher if they can't sit down. Because Jesus is known for sermons that are verbose, long. Okay, so, by the way, pretty much all the rabbis were. As a result, then, expect him to do that early morning and to be able to project his voice before the afternoon winds pick up in the later afternoon. The guys will go to sleep in midday and sleep through the hottest part of the day. And then late afternoon, the breezes come up and they'll get their boats ready and get ready to go out for the evening. Normally having maybe 2 meals a day, mostly vegetarian. Deuteronomy 16:16 says 3 times a year you go up to Jerusalem, right? And one of the big encouragements of going up is you get meat. Okay? There's a grill. It's a wonderful thing. So there's a lot of reasons to look forward to it, but that's one of the reasons you look forward to it. That's a very base reason. What's that? They ate fish. They ate fish a lot. They ate a normal bread here would be barley for the poor. Wheat was for the wealthy. And barley, if you ever get a barley cake, it can be dense and stiff, very stiff and very dry. And so in the morning, if you want to have a breakfast cereal, you'd put a bed of honey, a barley cake, and warmed wine, which was mostly vinegary. And it's the interaction between the wine and the honey that would actually balance the two. Okay, what we have is a long walking area here that was put here for the papal visit some years ago, and a strolling area, which is one of the more expensive pavements in the land, never to be used by virtually anyone. But what a great plan, you know? Now, when you look down to the right, you're looking at ancient coves. Imagine that there were these coves for small fishing boats, and there were more buildings here in antiquity than are here today. Imagine that if you had 3 or 4 houses in a kind of a square or a circular fashion, a break in the house is like the city gate, okay? It's basically you prop up something that closes it at night, you open it, and it's the 4 or 5 houses that are in the circle. The center would be where you're drying your nets, fixing your nets, and there would be many of these coves. Okay, the property is Kfar Nahum. Kfar is village. Nahum, comfort, village of comfort. Comfortable spot to live. Nahum, Nahum, is the name of one of the prophets, but probably not associated with this. Now, what I can tell you about the village is that it was already an old town by the time Jesus came here. And that for several hundred years before, they had been building very large insula-style homes. Now, I stopped here for a reason. The property is under the Franciscan administration. So Francis is the statue that's behind me. Some of you may not know the story of how this develops, but it's very simple. In 999, December 31st, 11 o'clock at night, there were across Europe masses of people filling churches for what I'm going to call Y1K. Yeah. They thought Jesus would come again with the turning of the 1000th year. Don't tell them that doesn't happen until a year later than that. Don't even get into that. But the fact of the matter is, you're going to be shocked, but Jesus didn't come. Why didn't he come? That's the next 100 years. The next 100 years of church debates come up with 2 answers as to why Jesus didn't come. The first one was the greatest militaristic movement within the church, and that was Pope Urban and the Crusades, 1099. The second one, parallel to it, the greatest peace movement in the church, and that's about 1181 to 1226, Francis. And the idea is, the problem is either that we haven't freed the Holy Land from the infidels, or we haven't freed our hearts from our sin. One of the two, or maybe both. And so this represents a group of people that are, interestingly enough, come from a movement of peace that administrates lands largely acquired during war. Okay? But the Franciscan administration of the Holy Land sites has been a part of the fabric of the country since the founding of the State of Israel and even before. And the important thing about that is we're thankful for these guys. Because let me tell you something. If the churches didn't take over properties, there'd be an industry growing here and nobody would know where anything happened from the Gospels. But because people have a vested interest in their own faith past, they came, they dug, they learned, they grew in archaeology. Sometimes the earlier archaeology of the church wasn't as accurate as it should have been, but it got better and better and better and more scientific. And now they oversee a lot of the Holy Land sites. You're going to see a cross with 4 crosses around it, and you're going to see that in many places where there are Franciscans where there's the Terra Sancta communities, that is the communities that oversee the Holy Land, they actually come from the Latin Kingdom. So following the Crusades, there was an establishment of a Latin kingdom with 5 major cities, the largest of which was Jerusalem, and was founded right there at the place where the cross was. And so those are 4 cities surrounding Jerusalem of the Latin kingdom. It later became used as the azimuth marker of a map. So 00 azimuth on every ancient map until 1860, when the US Navy gave us the meridian system, was the center of the world, was halfway between Calvary and the resurrection place. And so what you have is, that was the belly button of the world, 00. And it's marked in the floor of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Prior to that, 00 in a Roman map would have been in the center of the forum. And there's a place for that, for the belly button of the world in the forum as well. And so that idea transferred over, okay? I just wanted you to know who's watching over the properties. We're going to go inside to Capernaum. Okay, directly behind me, do you remember yesterday I asked a question? Who's going to win the hearts and minds of our kids? Tell me what country these could have been found in if they weren't found in Israel. Greece or Rome? Okay, these are pieces of a synagogue, and you said they looked Greece or Rome. So 300 to 400 years after Jesus, who did win the hearts and minds of the kids? The aniconic people became like Greco-Romans in their artwork. And if you look all the way over here, you see a 6-pointed star called the Star of David, but David never knew that was his star. In fact, it was not even specifically a Jewish item until 1,000 years after Jesus. You will find those inside things like the Dome of the Rock built in 691. So it's not specifically Jewish till 1000 AD. Next to it is a 5-pointed star with 5 balloons around it called the Star of Solomon, which it was his star, except for Solomon didn't have nearly as good a press secretary as David, so nobody knows that's his. But jar handles from the Solomonic period have 5 balloons with a 5-pointed star like that, and it is known as the Star of Solomon. Then you see the acanthus leaves and all of these rosettes and all of this as part of the pediment. But look, wait, birds. Do you remember that there was in Judaism within Exodus 20, the law, you will make no graven image, that you will bow down and worship it. There are traditions in Judaism that say no pictures, emphasizing the first half. And some of you come from churches like that emphasize the first half. No graven images. You wouldn't put a statue or a picture up. There are others that you bow down and worship it. You can have it, you just can't pray to it. Okay? Now I'd like you to think about something. In Judaism, there was only one of these buildings in all of the world, and it was the place where people met God in sacrifice. It was called the Temple. It was at Jerusalem. And there was the idea of closing in on the holiness of God. So there is in the lands a holy land, and in the holy land a holy city, and in the holy city a holy mountain, and in the holy mountain a holy place, and in the holy place a holy of holies. And that's, you closed in on the holiness of God. That was a Jewish idea picked up by Catholicism, so that you close in as you come into the cathedral or the church, moving in, closing in on the holiness of God, and the manifest presence of God is existing at the altar. That's an old idea. Now, there were only one temple, but there were many buildings like this one in all kinds of cities all over the Jewish world, where you came and studied the scriptures. After the time of Ezra, someone would read the text, then give the sense and the interpretation. After Ezra did it in Ezra 8. My statement would be, there are many of these, what are they called? Synagogues. Now the synagogue is about the word and learning the word. The temple is about the sacrifice. I need you to think for a minute. Catholicism picked up the temple side of Judaism, where the focus of the service is the smoke, the altar, and the death. It's about a sacrifice in the elements of the Mass. Protestantism picked up the synagogue side of Judaism, where it's about the word and the argument to understand the word better. I'd like to make the argument that we need each other. That it's possible to go into a Catholic church, you'll see beauty, you'll experience all kinds of things, you'll stand when they stand, sit when they sit, sing when they sing, but you might not learn anything. But on the other hand, in some of our churches, you will saunter in with your coffee cup in hand to the gymnatorium to worship the living God. And we might be missing something in the idea of worship. So, these guys obviously said it's okay to have a living creature, but you can't bow down and worship it. The temple in Jerusalem did not allow you to put a coin in the coffer because it had an image of a face. So, remember that the shekel in the Hebrew scriptures is a weight of silver. In the New Testament, it's a coin and it has a face on it. So you have to exchange it. That's why money changers exist in the second temple, but not in the first. They exist in the New Testament, but not in the Old. Okay? Let me continue down and take a look. There's an urn here, a Greek-style urn, and I'm going to move my way down. We're walking on down. You'll see these fluted pillars. Did any of you come from a liturgical background? A background maybe Catholic or Greek Orthodox, something like that? Okay. If you came from a liturgical background, you know that the elements of the Mass, the elements of the sacristy, are actually behind a curtain and a wood door. That comes from Judaism. The Torah scrolls were kept behind a curtain and a wood door. So the actual archisolio that once had the scrolls of the law were probably behind this. Now, we don't know exactly where it goes in that synagogue, so they've left them out here because the father that did this excavation didn't want to trick you. He just found pieces and didn't want to put it all back together. But we think that this is their ark for the law, and we think so because over here they have an ark on wheels like the ark of the Bible, but it looks like theirs. So that might be what they're telling us. So the idea of the mystery of God's presence in His Word behind a wood door and behind a curtain brought out to the people, God's Word open to the people, was the idea of the ancient synagogue. These all come from the 4th and 5th century after Jesus, and I'm pulling you past them because we got other stuff to see. Okay, guys, now what we have behind us is an insulus, is a house. It is contemporary to the first century community, here for about 50 years before the time of Jesus. And I need to go back in time. So let's start with the most modern building and go backwards if we can, okay? First, let's start with the church above me. And let me just say, in defense of the people that are here, it's not their fault. Originally, the church was shaped to be like a boat with a high mast in the center. Archaea, a company that flies over here, changed their flight lines after it was approved, and they cut the top of the church off. So now it looks like a flying saucer. It was supposed to be a boat. It's a boat of sorts, okay? But here's what I love about the church. Notice the people going up inside. When the groups go up and they have prayer or mass, there's a glass floor beneath them and above the site. That allows people to come and visit the site while people are having a mass inside without jeopardizing both access to the site. But remember, in Catholicism, if you put your altar above something that is sacred, it adds sanctity to the altar. So often relics are put beneath. Well, in this case, an altar can go above that if this is an important site to you. Let's lift it off. Okay, now that's gone. What you have beneath it now is this octagonal church. Do you see that there's an octagonal 5th century church? So the center has what looks like a dome, and then there's an octagonal wall, stop sign here. Do you see a white wall with black stones? And it's an octagon. And the octagonal church shaped like a big stop sign with a dome on the inside. So there's an inside circle and then an outside octagon. Can you see it? And the floor for it is this mosaic over here. Now, let's lift that out. That's a 5th century church. That's when, this is after the fall of Rome and just about the time of the fall of Rome when the church is taking over. And when we talk about the church, I need you to not think non-Catholic Christians always assume that everything before their movement was just Catholic. Remember, that for 1,000 years, people didn't necessarily have a Mariology that was anything close to Catholicism, but you would have called them Catholic. They didn't get the Immaculate Conception of Mary until the 1800s. That meant for most of the life of what people would call Catholic, they weren't the Catholics you know. The problem we have is a fixation where we go to whatever they are now and backdate it to the beginning. Constantine started it and it had these bullet points. No, he didn't. That's not what happened. So people evolved in their understanding of theology, and sometimes you would like them and sometimes you wouldn't. Okay? So let's take this 5th century church out. And do you see beneath the center wall of the 5th century church, there's another home. There's a long set of walls going this way, another wall that's kind of in the center there where they broke through this later wall. And the floor of that home is here, and you'll see it around here. That's a 4th century domus ecclesia, house church, meaning a house that had become a formal meeting place that was now formalized after Christianity was a religio licita, a legitimate religion in the empire. Now let's take that out. Now let's go to the very center. Go all the way down to the bottom. And what you'll see is that's the home. It's down there. Okay? Now the home itself is a home between the sea and the synagogue. There are two, this one and the neighbor's house. Mark chapter 1 suggests in the narrative that Peter's mother-in-law's house was between the sea and the synagogue. So an evidence might be found in Mark chapter 1 geographically. But add to that a second level, and that is inside this was found etchings in the plaster of prayers to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the name of Yeshua, in the name of Jesus. A third evidence, when the Domus Ecclesia was founded on top of the church, the house, they actually arched over the older walls of the home to keep them intact and build the building on top of it, to suggest that the building before it was sacred. Okay? Does that mean it's the right place? I don't know, but these are the evidences that we're looking at. The other thing I want you to know is when you're looking at this house, one of the sadnesses is for Peter, why would Peter move into his mother-in-law's house? Remember I told you that Bethsaida over there, Bethsaida was Old Testament city Gesher, became Bethsaida, was being paganized and changed to Julius, and a pagan temple got located in the downtown of an RJ village. So what happened to the RJs? We think they moved out. Fine, you want to bring that paganism in here? We're heading for another town. So expect the Zebedee boys to have been dispossessed of their hometown. They've got an attitude. And they move from Bethsaida and they come to Capernaum. And Peter is moved in with his mother-in-law. Now, that first of all tells you she's married. Someone asked me, does that necessarily mean he's married? Of course, why would you get a mother-in-law without a wife? That doesn't even sound like a good idea. I'm thinking, but there is a case in which you would not bring your bride to your home. And that is if Peter's marrying into a family that has no male heirs. Ladies, you remember, you can slice, dice, buy, and sell real estate, but you cannot transfer property without a male heir. You can't do it. It doesn't matter if it's an infant, but you have to sign in his name. There must be a male heir. That's the story of Ruth and Naomi. That's the whole story. So the problem is this: if Peter's mother-in-law has no male heir, Peter, in order to love his wife, would have to leave his name and pick up her father's name and move into that house. And so it's probably a sad condition, or it might tell you that Peter was such a loudmouth he couldn't find anybody else to marry, and so somebody who was desperate took him. I don't know. I'm just saying, So you have a house in the 1st century, becomes a Domus Ecclesia, expanded, becomes a 5th century church, becomes a close encounter. Okay? So that's what you have. Now here's the problem. You can't see much here, so I want to take you to Peter's mother-in-law's neighbor's house to show you something better, because this house has a church on top. Okay, so let's go take a look. All right, if you all would get so that you can see the house, here's what I want you to see. This is one house. This is an insula, but this one happens to be full. So a third of these rooms are home, a third of these rooms are work and or storage rooms for whatever the industry that the person's doing here is. We know that the industries of Capernaum included, number one, fishing. It's a great place to fish because you're near the sea. Second, agriculture. There are a lot of open terraces on the outside. Third, the making of millstones. Now, if you look straight back toward the big, tall, straight up tree back there, can you see that there's a round stone that looks like Fred Flintstone's front tire? That's a roof roller. It looks like a little column with a hole in the side. That's a roof roller. And do you notice that if you go all the way over to the left where the door to the street is, there's a set of stairs there. There was a second floor on this house, on at least part of it. I want you to see that this is a very large insula, 150 people living there, all with the same last name. Okay, what you're looking at is a successful home, meaning if you had big open spaces, that would be sad. I could take you to Bethsaida. Remember at the Bethsaida dig? It's only a couple of rooms and lots of open courtyard. That's an unsuccessful family. A successful family is the one that has many sons and they actually grow up and they actually move their families in and they all live around the inside. The Talmud says that a woman can't go beyond the second door of the house unaccompanied. We didn't know what that meant until these houses were found. The door out to the street is the second door. The door into the house is the first. So if each of you lives in one room, you can step out into the courtyard and go to any other room in the house, but you don't go out onto the street unaccompanied because you're of great value to the family. One of the things I want you to know is that in study of Judaism, I found that over time, many people in the West do not understand, for instance, the fact that marriage laws for women were underneath property law as a subset in the law. And so they naturally concluded in the feminist environment of our day that this was an anti-woman environment. It's not true. Guys, it took 5 people working all year long in a farm steadily. Their work would produce enough for 6 people to eat. That means that if you come to take my daughter out of the home, you are taking one of the vital workers that will feed us. That's why property compensation has to be given to a father to get my daughter. Because it's an economic system in which we're not trying to be up and coming, we're trying to eat. Okay? You have to understand that in 1950, one farmer was producing in America enough because of machinery and irrigation for 50 people. Today's agribusiness worker, because we don't have farmers anymore, but today's agribusiness worker, 2,000 people for each person working. In other words, we have an unprecedented level of success in terms of our farming. So in antiquity, it took 5 people to raise enough for 6. So you would all eat if it was a good year. Guys, what that really means is that the biblical person knows what it means to go hungry. That not every year is a good year. And some year there's nothing to trade at the market. So you just can't get without borrowing. Now, that's why the borrowing system was limited under the law. If at the end of a 7-year cycle, there's going to be forgiveness of debt, and at the end of a 49-year cycle, there's total forgiveness and reset of the property, then you're never going to loan somebody something more than you're going to get back in that term. That limits how much people will borrow. That's the idea. So a lot of the laws have common sense applications. All right. Now, if I'm living in that home right there, and my brother Russ is next to him, and my brother Roger's next to him, and my brother Ryan's next to him, and I could go on for a while. There were 15 of us, okay? So, and each one of us grows up here, and as we go out, I discover, let's say I find a girl that I want to marry. Now, here's what I won't do. I won't go talk to her. Because if you talk to her, we'll both lose face. We'll lose honor in the society. So I will go, and let's say I find, Mike, you've got this daughter. She's gorgeous. I want to marry your daughter. Here's how I'll do it. First of all, how do I know she's gorgeous? Since she's mostly covered most of the time whenever she's in public. I talk to her brother. That's how you get information. Second, I would never talk to her. I would go to Mike and I would say, Mike, Your daughter is so ugly, she will scare the wool off my sheep.
And I would say, but you're so mistaken, my son.
You are so mistaken. No, 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 she's very beautiful. And we would begin to negotiate. I start low, he starts high. You know how this works. Now, I'm not buying a wife, a good wife who can find. She's more precious than gems. I'm not buying one because I can't afford one. What I'm doing is determining the level of compensation that has to go to his family for the removal of his daughter. And we would agree on something. Now, if he agrees on this amount, the daughter's out in the field, let's say, and the son runs out and says, I think the guy that wants to marry you is here. So what happens is she'll come in, she'll start pinching her face, try to get a little color in it, brush out the hair and, whatever. And she'll come in and she'll meet me. Now, if she knows nothing about me, she'll just follow through the ceremony. But if she knows something about me, like I'm a philanderer or something, she would go out of the room and not come back. If she agrees to the marriage, she will go out, go to the cask of the family's best wine, and pour a glass of wine. And then she will go and get from the family starter dough a little bit of the dough and roll it into some dough and make a flat cake, bake the cake, and come back. All the time, we're having a negotiation about how long it will be, where exactly the wedding's going to, all this is going on. It will be satisfied in what's called the shidduchim. The shidduchim is a contract that has to do with the engagement ceremony. We have these on record in Israel Museum. You can read them. One of them's wrapped in the same roll as the guy's divorce papers, which I don't think is particularly promising, but nevertheless, we have them. Now, here's the deal. What I'm going to do is I'm going to agree to go and build on my father's house. Ladies, you would not, unless you were royalty or somebody in a public office, you would not know when exactly your wedding is going to be, but you'd know about when in the week it was going to be. Okay, what's the day for first marriages in Judaism? Traditionally, the day for first marriages, Tuesday. And because Tuesday is the day of the week when God said it is good twice in the narrative of creation. It's a double good day. It's also the hardest day to get a 5-star hotel room in Jerusalem because it's the time when there's weddings, okay? All right, Wednesday is second marriages. So if you lost your first spouse, your second marriage would be on Wednesday, and that allows the rabbi time to get back in time for the services for the weekend, and he doesn't have to walk on Sabbath, okay? But the point is, you would know it's coming up on a Tuesday. You just wouldn't know which Tuesday. Now, here's what happens. She goes out of the room, she comes back in, she gives me a piece of bread. I hold up that bread and bless God. Listen carefully. Only Christians bless their food. Jews bless God. You don't bless dead things. You don't bless this hamburger. It's dead. It's not going to do anything it ever did. It's over. So you bless God for the food. You don't bless the food. Okay? But at any rate, I would bless God for the bread because it represents the needs of my life. Give us this day our daily bread. These are the things you need. Then I would take and I would break that bread and I would eat some from it and I would hand her some. And this is her first act of service to me, her future husband. And then I would hold up the cup and I would bless God because the wine represents the joys God gave us that we don't need, but he gives us because he's a good God. And so I would then take a drink, give it to her, she would drink, and that's the engagement ceremony. I would go away and build onto my father's house, another room. And when I'm done, if I love her, I'm going to send a runner ahead. He's going to bang on a pot and wake her up and say, get the curlers out of your hair, get the makeup on your face, he's a-coming. I'm going to show up, usually in the middle of the night. I'm going to parade around the village and say, wherever you've got it on your day timer, forget it. Tomorrow there's going to be a wedding at Cana. Free food, free wine, 7 days, come. And everybody's ready to come. The babies are up crying, the whole place is coming apart. There is still a tradition in the northeast of the United States where people bang on pots on New Year's outside their houses walking around. That's an old Jewish wedding tradition. Now, I'm going to go away, prepare in my father's house, and at a certain time, I'm going to come back. Guys, listen to what I just told you. In John 14, Jesus is in the upper room. And he says, don't let your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many dwelling places. If it were not so, I would have told you, I go now to prepare a place for you. And if I go, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. But what does he leave behind? The symbol that I leave behind is bread and cup. And as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you preach, karudzon, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes back for you. But when you take that bread and that cup, I want you to remember what it felt like for you to slide onto the love of your life's finger a ring, or to have a ring slid on yours. Because what you're supposed to be doing with that bread and cup is saying, but I'm engaged to another, and I'm waiting for him. He's my first and highest love. So that bread and cup started off as a simple engagement ceremony. But when the message of Messiah went to Rome, they lost the significance and then began to decide whether it became the body, represented the body, turned into the body, and you end up with a transubstantiation, which I literally believe has nothing to do with the original event at all. Everybody in that room knew what Jesus was saying. Guys, you know about getting married. Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to go away. I'm going to come back. There's going to be a wedding. And I'm going to leave you a bread and cup, just so you know. And it's a simple thing. Now, imagine a house like this filled with Jesus, his disciples, people that are pressed in to follow him. And it's so impossible when his mother and brothers come to Capernaum, they're knocking on the outside door, they can't get anywhere near him. And he doesn't go out and see them. A couple of guys have a friend whose legs don't work. And what do? They climb up the outside of the insula, not this one, probably the one next door, but they climb up the outside, go over to the place of the room where Jesus is underneath, remove the mud, remove the cloth, remove the Cana reed, and lower the man down inside. The great part of that story is that Jesus has a delegation sent from Jerusalem of all these important dignitaries who are going to listen to him, and his boys are tearing the roof open on top of them. So he's like, oh great, this is going to be the impression I wanted to leave. I'm going to sit here and teach. Now what's interesting about that story is, and I don't want you to miss this, it took 4 men to bring one. And sometimes bringing somebody to Christ takes 3 and 4 and 5 people. And for some of you, you're going to have to strategically partner with others to love people into the kingdom. Sometimes you just can't do it alone. You're going to need the support of others. And let me just say this. When others see you loving each other and working well together, they will be drawn to what you have. Because there is nobody out there doing encouragement outside of Christ. You can't name 5 unsaved people that called you to encourage you. That's not the world we live in. But did you notice when they lowered the man down, all of a sudden, Jesus says, rise up and walk. And he gets up, and they're amazed. And he says something very startling. He says, which do you think is harder? For me to say your sins are forgiven you, or rise up and walk? You remember what he did? He said your sins are forgiven you, but he didn't heal the man. He left him laying there. And later on he said rise up and walk. I believe in our churches today, if Jesus asked that question, he would get the answer, it's harder to make him walk than save his sins. Because that's where we put our priorities. Jesus said once I saved him, didn't matter whether he could walk. But the fact of the matter is we put so much trust in this life that we are drawn to the physical healing over the spiritual new life. And something's wrong with our priority. So we have this insula-style house, and what's fascinating about it is it's a good way for you to capture the way a large number of people are crowded in around Jesus. Now, Peter's mother, by the way, the one story we don't have in the Gospels is what Peter's mother-in-law said when she got home and her roof was ripped off, which I personally think would have been a precious jewel for the Gospels, but I didn't write them. Now, what you have are actually pieces of 8 buildings overall, 2 of which we saw, one that's under the church, one that's the Peter's mother-in-law's neighbor's house. And then next to that is this large white synagogue, which is a 5th century synagogue, and it's contemporary to the octagonal church, which was underneath the modern church, okay? We'll come back to the synagogue in a minute, but let's just remind ourselves that the original synagogue that was there was not white, but black. And it followed the same footprint as the one that's there now. Why do I say that? Well, people used to say, you see the black basalt underneath the white wall there? They would say, well, that's the foundation. Guys, these people do stone for a living. They're flush on this end and they're 8 inches off on the other. What that tells you is that's an earlier building, not a foundation. And so as a result, Father Corbeau dug through the floor of the white synagogue and found, guess what? There's an earlier synagogue underneath of it. And there's a little Beit Midrash, there's a little teaching center beneath that, alongside of it on the other side of the building. And so here's what we know. We know something more about that synagogue. Do you remember that Luke tells us that a centurion's servant needed healing? And so the centurion came to Jesus and said, would you heal my servant? And the local community said, oh, but this man has done much to help us build our synagogue. Please help him. And Jesus heals the servant. And that means the centurion's not going to tell on Jesus when Herod Antipas is looking for him. The important thing is that the synagogue he would have helped build was the black one underneath there. Now look alongside there and you'll see a palm tree growing up. Okay, there's a palm tree growing up and it's actually intersecting the street. That's the street level from the period of the Gospels. And that street comes all the way back to a house that's behind us. Do you see that there's a set of stairs going up right here? And there's the back of a house that's almost adjacent to the back door of the synagogue. Now today, if you went to a synagogue, there is an official position at the synagogue called the chazan. The earlier use of that term chazan was the term sexton, or janitor who holds the keys. That's the old use of the word. So normally the chazan was the person who lived directly behind the back of the synagogue. Why? Because if you need the keys, you need to know where he is, right? So this guy with his set of stairs is right here. He's often referred to, in a Latin term, ruler of the synagogue. It doesn't mean he's like the potentate. It means he's the guy who's got the keys, okay? And since that's true, we know that Jesus gets off of a boat and he's standing at the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and a man comes to him who's a ruler of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and says, my daughter's lying at the point of death. Please come. Please take care of my daughter. And he walks down the street from the sea to the man's house. We're probably standing right where he was, walking through. Now, I want to introduce you when we get to Jerusalem to what the Gospels call the press. The press is what happens when you put 14 buses in a little room, okay? Jesus is walking through the press. Now, in Mark's Gospel, it says that there was a woman who was for many years suffering from the issue of blood. Issue of blood for her meant she was ceremonially, perpetually unclean. She didn't have the natural coagulants in her blood to stop her bleeding. And so she went to many physicians and she suffered many things of many physicians, what it says. And that's why they call medicine a practice, right? They practiced on her and they kept bleeding her, which was the normal means of solving the problem. This went on, by the way, in antiquity, went on all the way up until the time of George Washington. He was in Valley Forge and they were bleeding him until the blood ran thick in the bottle. They nearly killed the man trying to make him well. And my point is, if you don't have the right coagulants in the blood and your blood's not acting properly, the last thing you want to do is be cut by someone. So but ladies, think about her problem. She can't make lunches for her kids. She doesn't sleep in her bed with her husband. She doesn't hug her children before they go to school. Why? Because she's unclean and would make them unclean, and God made her that way and she doesn't know why. There's nothing fair about it, but she doesn't know what to do. And then she hears, wait, Jesus is coming. If I can just touch the hem of his garment. Now there's a number of different ways to understand that phrase. Maybe it means touch the edge of his prayer shawl. More than likely, what it means is touch the fringe or the tzitziot. These are the fringes on the four corners of your garment. Do you remember Numbers 15 said that you have to put on the four corners of your garment these tassels. How many of you moved a tassel when you graduated? Okay, that's an old Bronze Age way of saying I've attained something new. As far back as 1700 BC, in a place called Mari, Syria, we have the Mari tablets. Tablets were found there in Mari, so we call them the Mari tablets. Catchy, right? Here's the thing. On the tablets, these are clay tablets where people were buying bushels of apples and stuff, and they were inserting into the clay knotted cord. It would have 3 knots, then a space, then 2 knots, then a space, then 5 knots, then a space, then 1 knot, then a space. And they'd press it into the clay. And here's what we discovered. They were wearing tassels on their garments that were credit cards. When they went into the market, your family gave you a tassel, and that tassel became the basis of your credit. And how many of you remember ka-chunk machines? Before there were magnetic strips, you set the thing down and you went ka-chunk. I have no idea what they're called, but they're ka-chunk machines to me. Okay? All right, so that's ancient. You would press into clay, the clay would dry, and that would say, this is your charge against your family. Rather crude way of doing it, but this is the way they did it. Now, I want you to imagine this woman is in the press. She's not in front of Jesus. In fact, I can tell you where the disciples are in the story. If you read Mark chapter 5 very closely, here's what you'll find out. In Mark 4 and 5, as Jesus is walking, Jairus has invited them into the house, and the disciples are first. Jesus is behind them. How do I know? Because the woman comes up behind Jesus. She goes to touch the edge of the garment, but the tassel comes off in her hand. She just lifted his Amex card. Jesus, knowing authority had gone out of him, not my spiritual battery pack got drained, but somebody just lifted my credit card. Who's got my tassel? It has in it a riband of blue because they are a royal people. That's why there's blue at the top and bottom of the Israeli flag today. But the tassel itself was given to him by his mother. This would be important to him. The disciples weren't behind him. They were in front of him. Why? Because we're going to Jairus' house. And look at that. I'm with Jairus, picture. And they're really excited about being with somebody who's important. And they're rushing ahead to get there. And Jesus is standing back there going, what happened to my card? Who's got my card? The woman is in the background, knowing that there's been a change in her life, knowing that the blood is dried up. She's standing there trembling because she's got this thing in her hand. She didn't mean to take it. Now you should know that you weren't supposed to tie the tassel on. You were supposed to loop the tassel on. I don't think she meant to keep on clinging to it. But the Greek verb is very specific. She grabbed it and kept on clinging. In other words, it came off in her hand. Now she's got it, she doesn't know what to do with it. So she walks up to Jesus and she gives it back to him, fearing and trembling. And he says, what? Daughter, your faith has made you whole. Now let's, guys, de-Christianize the word faith. Faith means God glasses. It's seeing it the way the Bible says it is, not the way I would see it if I didn't know God's word. Faith is not some mystical quantity. It's seeing it the way God says it is. God looks at this group of people out here and sees two kinds of people. People who know him and people who need to. And all the other distinctions are less important. The important thing is, when I see it through a biblical worldview, I'm seeing it by faith. If I ask you, what is faith? Please don't tell me the substance of things hoped for. I mean, it sounds like a legal definition. What I want you to say is, seeing it the way God says it is. Because with faith, you can move mountains. Why? Because if God says it's gone, it's gone. If God says, run for that wall with all your might, run and hope he puts a hole there when you get there. But you do it because that's what he told you to do. Faithfulness is your job. Fruitfulness is his job. You don't worry about what it does. You worry about what you do. You take responsibility for what you do. Okay, now, your faith has made you whole. She grabbed him, believing that his authority could heal her illness, which is, by the way, the only way you can get healed, okay, in that kind of format. So the idea here is, daughter, you already believed what you needed to believe when you reached for it. I want you to remember something. The first sin was not eating a fruit. The first sin was deciding to reach for it. Sin is of the heart, not of the hands. Okay? It always happens here. Let me say it this way. Adultery occurs in the head before the bed every time. Okay? It happens here and it happens here. So our problem isn't conforming our practices. It's addressing our heart. And until I address my heart, I can live like a Christian and not be one. True?
True.
You can pull off Christianity without ever having a relationship with God, just by mimicking what you see. And plenty of people are. So Jesus right there changes this woman's life. Now here's the problem. There's a girl dying upstairs. And this woman's giving him back the tassel, and that's all well and good. She goes on her way, she is made well, and the kid dies. So coming down the stairs, they say, leave the master alone. She's dead already. Jesus walks into the room and says, she's not dead, she's sleeping. And they begin to laugh in a mocking way. Pah! Now what's interesting is, look at the juxtaposition of a woman who feels abandoned by God, but reaches out for her last hope, hoping against hope, as opposed to a room full of people who asked him to come, but don't really believe he knows what he's doing well enough to know whether the baby is alive or dead. He will bring in the disciples, he will raise up the child, and the great crescendo of the story, give her something to eat, and he walks out. And that's the end of the story. And I love that end, because it's like, she's fine, give her something to eat. You have to remember that people in antiquity were living within a 5 or 10 mile of where they were born. They didn't have news. That meant if an army was going to come over the hill and take away our children, we knew when we saw them. You woke up every day not sure what that day was going to bring. Think about that for a minute. Because we check the weather 5 days ahead, and we walk around. Something happens on the other side of the world, and we're watching it on our phone in 5 minutes. They didn't know. Life was uncertain, unpredictable, short, and harsh. And so when you're looking at these folks who are seeing Jesus, he's able to bring hope to them. And there's a simple story. Now, by the way, it's not the only tassel story that's in the Bible. You're going to hear more of them later. But they're there. They're behind the scenes. And the writer just expects you to know how people dress and what's on them. Okay? If you don't do that, here's what happens. You make up a spiritual battery pack for Jesus. His mystical authority had gone out of him. Well, how does that work exactly? See, I could take you 8 hours south. I can go down into the Sinai Desert. I can take you to a certain corner on the Sinai Desert. I have walked that desert many times with camels. I can bang a rock and fill your canteen with water. I can do it. And I do not do miracles. Here's my point. When you don't know how it works, everything's a miracle. You know, it's like you get off on some desert island, they've never seen anything before, you take out a Bic lighter, you light it, and they go, ah, and they start bowing down. Everything's a miracle when you don't know how it works. So what happened in church history is every time we didn't understand the custom, we just added a miracle. And that is a normal thing for church art and church customs, okay? Let's keep going. Watch your head, please. Please do not damage the archaeology. Okay, I'm inside the synagogue. This is the central nave. It comes from the word for a body of a ship. Those are the side aisles. They later become ambulatories, but these are the side aisles. Now look upstairs, because there's a second floor to this one. In synagogues, the women are segregated to another part of the building. And again, immediately in the Western context, people will say, oh, because they were anti-woman, or they thought, no. Listen, the rabbis were an all-male group, okay? And they taught that women were smarter than men. I can show it to you, that women were smarter than men. Here's what they said. They said, you need to bring the men in and put them in here. The most important seats are there by the door. By the way, the pulpit's inside the front door. If you come late, you have to walk past the pulpit to go to your seat. It's a high motivator, okay? Now, here's what he said. They said, The men have to be in the room to get the lesson. The women could be upstairs behind a curtain with the children and still get the lesson. But if the women are in the room, the men will never get the lessons. And then there's one line in the Talmud that says, happy is the woman that makes him think it's his idea. I love that line. I think that is a great line, okay? So here's the deal. I didn't come into Christianity the way most of you did. I refused to believe until I went and followed the story. I wanted to know what we knew. And here's what I can tell you, and I say this with all my heart. We do not follow cleverly devised myths. I've walked every place Jesus was, every place Paul was, every place Moses was. These aren't myths. The detail is exacting. The harder you look at it, the more complete the story becomes. And I've walked into college classroom after college classroom and had people tell me that it wasn't like that. And I'm just saying, these feet, every one of the places, these feet. Now tell me what it is that we don't know that you think unravels our story. And what I find is that generally somebody's hurt, so they're angry at God, so he can't be who we say he is. That's what this all comes down to. I had a debate. The University of Thessaloniki's professor of Aristotle chair, professor of philosophy, was on a cruise ship. He was playing a pagan. I played Paul the Apostle. His subject was why I'd rather not be a Christian. Mine was why you should be a Christian. So we're having this debate, and it's in front of a couple hundred people. It's for the History Channel. So I'm doing this debate, and I'm sweating bullets because I want to nail this thing, and I'm probably one of the only believers in the room. I walk out onto the deck. I'm not kidding. I walked out onto the deck after we were done because they had like a green room, like where you can prepare, and they let the two of us go out so we could kind of clean off because we were both sweating profusely under the hot lights before we went out to talk to the people. He walks out onto the deck. There's a little area, and we're standing there, and we're holding onto the side rail, and he looks at me and he goes, I'm on my third wife, and my life is miserable. That's how he came out of the debate. A brilliant man with a big hole in his heart. And I looked at him and I said, life's going by pretty quick. You're going to want to do something about that. And I just left it there. And I said to him, anytime you want to talk, I will be willing to talk to you. We had 2 other conversations after that. But my point is, full heads don't fill up empty hearts. And you can have all kinds of knowledge and have an empty heart. And what I find is that people fill in how we're wrong because their heart is hurt. Ask the question, why did Darwin write what he wrote? What happened to him the 5 months before? And then you'll get the answer as to why he did what he did. It's not, honestly, there was a big problem in his family and his heart was broken. All I'm saying is that doesn't make our case right. We still have to prove our case. But very often the real problem isn't the problem. The real problem is that we walk around thinking that we can argue people into the kingdom. You can't. I lived here long enough to know that I don't argue people into the kingdom. I'll present my case and they'll present theirs, and that's fine. But there's a spirit involved here. Look, who sins first in Genesis?
Cain.
Wow. Yeah. Okay, there were 2 people in a garden in the beginning of the story. Okay, now you have two sins. The man's sin was not guarding her. The woman's sin was the first active sin. And she decided, I have to look out for number 1. That's the beginning of sin right there. God is not looking out for my best interest, I have to. So I better reach for this. Okay, so who sins first? Well, actively Eve does. But I want you to understand something. In the penalty, this is the rabbinic commentary in the penalty. Okay, there'll be pain in the bearing of the child for the woman. There'll be, the soil will work against the man. But it also says something else to the woman. It says, and your preference shall be to your man. Now the way the rabbis dissected that is, you will want his job. You will desire to take and usurp his place. Ladies, I have 2 daughters and I want them to do everything they could possibly do, and this is not me trying to keep them barefoot pregnant in the kitchen. This is not chauvinism. Here's what I'm saying to you. Do you know why God said a woman couldn't take a vow by herself? because there was a positional statement of headship that endured. You go, but that's under the law. In 1 Corinthians 14 it says that's why we do it in the church, because of the law. In other words, I'm not trying to tell you you can't do everything I can do. I don't believe that. I believe that neither of us are given everything to do. I am not called to tell young women how to love their husbands. That's a job for older women. The problem is we confuse value for service. I'm not worth more because I serve in this part of the body and you're worth less because you don't. It's not about value. It's about whose job it is to do what. So there is a command chain in Scripture that has to do with headship. Now remember, it's all based on this. Jesus has a father who is his head. Is Jesus less than his father? No. Then if a woman has a husband that is her head, is she less than her husband? No, it's not about value. It's about function. And what we do is we confuse those two. The rabbis taught that she would want his job, that she would be in an avid search to try and get the position of the standing head of the family. And God didn't design the family that way. Now, I got to tell you, my wife's not here, so from the cheap seats I can talk. That has nothing to do with who does what. She does the books because she's better at them than I am. She's the saver, I'm the spender. That's just the way it is. So don't turn that into something I'm not trying to say, okay? I don't think people should be limited, but I think they should stop thinking their value comes from what they do.
Right.
Because your value isn't what you do. Okay. Now, they punched through a hole through the floor here, and they found that there was a teaching area. So now the Beit Midrash, or the teaching center's over here. Remember, the synagogue wasn't just a place where you had services, it's also the public meeting space. So here that was also done. Okay, we've done enough talking, so I'm going to walk you out to a little spot, and then I want to share with you something by the Sea of Galilee. So if you would choose to, take your pictures and then follow me out. Okay, we're up underneath this rubber tree, and we're sitting by the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And when we say shore, we mean place where water meets land. Has nothing to do with beach, okay? It's mostly rocky and stony, but you're on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee. And there's a story set on the north shore of the sea that I've reflected on many times. One of the things I like to think of is when God put on human skin, this is where he chose to live. I always thought that was interesting, just walking around here. And I always thought it was interesting that he chose before the technology boom. And he chose a time when walking between places was the way you got from one place to another. Folks, I wonder if we're not doing ourselves a disservice by believing that milliseconds and megabytes are how to measure life. I wonder if we don't do a disservice to ourselves by jumping on flights, getting off flights, going and speaking, jumping back on the flight, flying across to the other country, jumping off, speaking again, without the breaks that just traveling from one place to another on foot is all about. Remember, it's not go and make disciples. It's in your going, make disciples. Meaning, as you're living, live it in front of these others that you're training. And one of the things I'm so excited about is the way disciples learned to be disciples was not quick. Would you be open to the idea that everything that ever happens in Peter's life happens in threes? He's what I call the cranially challenged disciple. He needs 3 shots to get it right. He is called to be a disciple 3 times. He will deny Jesus 3 times. He will be told, feed my sheep, feed my lambs, feed my sheep, 3 times. When guys knock at the door in Acts chapter 10 to get him to go to Cornelius's house, there'll be 3 guys. When sheets come down out of heaven, there'll be 3 times. The guy takes a little longer to get it than everybody else. And early on, Peter followed after Jesus part-time. Then Jesus had him begin to follow him more. But do you remember, after Jesus is taken to Caiaphas' house, Peter is there. And it says John gets him in the front gate because John was known to the high priest. How? We don't know, but he was. So John and Peter get in. And there, Peter denies Jesus. And as he's denying him the third time, saying, I don't know the man, Jesus is being brought out and looks at him. And his discipleship is a failure. Well, the next time Jesus, after the resurrection, comes into the room with the disciples, it's the first time you see Peter in the room, but don't see Peter in the room. Peter's trying to be a wallflower. He's looking like a potted plant. He's hoping that Jesus doesn't notice him because he failed discipleship and he did it in front of the master. John 21 tells the third and final call of Peter, and it's one of my favorite stories in the Gospels. It says this: after Jesus manifested himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, this is the way he showed himself. Simon Peter and Thomas, called the twin, and Nathanael of Cana of Galilee, and the other sons of Zebedee, and two others of the disciples were together. And Simon Peter said, I'm going fishing. They said to him, we also will come with you. They went out, got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. It's another all-night failure. The last time was an all-night failure. I don't know the man. And he went out and wept bitterly. This one, I'm going fishing. Peter went back to what he knew, and Jesus met him there. Day was now breaking. Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples weren't sure that it was Jesus. Jesus said, men, do you have any fish? They answered him, no. And he said, cast the net on the right side of the boat and you will find a catch. So they cast. They weren't even able to haul in because of the great number of fish. Therefore, the disciple whom Jesus loved, John, said to Peter, Pete, it's the Lord. When Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment because he had stripped and his legs were showing. He threw himself into the sea, but the other disciples came in a little boat. They weren't that far from the land. That's a sarcastic comment. He says, Pete couldn't wait. He throws himself in the water. We weren't even that far away. They were 100 yards away, dragging a net full of fish. And when they got out on the land, they saw a charcoal fire already placed and fish already on it. Jesus calls to them to go and get fish so that he can show them that he is there. Jesus didn't need the fish they caught. He already had his fish. But he was about to do something profound. Do you remember that in the Bible and in the biblical world, you don't eat with somebody if you don't know them? Early on in the trip, generally, our drivers will not eat with the groups because most of them are more traditional Middle Easterners. And they don't feel right about eating with you because they don't know you. By the way, here, if somebody says, do you mind if I dunk? They mean in your coffee. It's communal eating. We eat off each other's plates and we eat off each other's hands. It's been that way for generations. My point is that you don't eat with somebody unless you have a relationship with them. That's why after Jacob and Laban got into a little argument because Laban tricked him, they sat down and had a meal together. That's why Psalm 23 says, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. It means you make me able to reconcile with my enemies so we can eat together. There's something in the Bible called a meal covenant. When you eat together, you're showing that you love and forgive and that you have fellowship with. That's why the Pharisees said to Jesus, why do you eat with publicans and sinners? We don't care if you talk to them, but why are you eating with them? So Jesus wants to have breakfast with Peter. Why? Because in front of the disciples, he needs Peter to understand it's okay. And he needs the other men to understand that he knows it's okay. He needs to reestablish in front of the men that Peter is loved, accepted, forgiven, Let's turn the page, Pete. We've got stuff to do. And so Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. None of the disciples ventured to question him, who are you? Knowing that it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and the fish likewise. It's interesting. Do you remember on the road to Emmaus, the people didn't know who Jesus was until he did what? As soon as he broke the bread and prayed to his Father, they saw it. Then they knew it was Jesus. Something about the way Jesus prayed made them know who he was. Well, here it says, this is the third time that Jesus was manifest to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. And when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? The these is neuter, the fish. Do you love me more than your occupation as a fisherman? The issue of the gospel is surrender, not knowledge, surrender. Do you love me more than this stuff that you have been doing? Yes, Lord. You know that I love you. Tend my lambs. He said to him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And he said, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said, shepherd my sheep. He said to him a third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter said, why do you ask, Lord? You know all things. You know that I love you. And he said, tend my sheep. Now, the interesting thing is this. Peter's tendency was to go back to what he knew. And Jesus said, stop being a fisherman, start being a shepherd. What's the difference? Would you be open to the idea that fishermen don't have to have a relationship with a fish, they just have to catch them? You were not called to evangelize. You were called to make disciples, and it starts with evangelism, but it doesn't stop there. You weren't called to catch them and clean them and notch your belt. You were called to raise them. So, the best illustration I can give you for shepherding is the word mom. It's caring. It's sharing. It's ever-changing. It's exhausting. And it's exhilarating. I want you to be open to an idea that when Peter was called, you remember, I will make you fishers of men? That was the early call. The end one, in going, mathetusite, make disciples. The Great Commission to the church is not to go to get people to sign on to Jesus. It's to go and grow them into knowing what that means. I was one. In the beginning of my Christian life, someone came and shared Jesus with me and then left me to find my way. I'm not discouraging you from reaching out in Jesus' name. I'm discouraging you from leaving them there. And I'm calling you to what I believe is God's call. And that is, this is going to sound really hard and some of you don't know me well. I think the reason we're not reaching our generation is we don't want to. I think they're going to take too much time and be very annoying and be very needy. And I think we like our stuff. I think it's just hard. I'm not talking to you, I'm talking to me. I think it's just hard. Because there seems to be a never-ending number of people who are needy. You know what I mean? And you're going, and our call is to tend, shepherd, love, raise, and pour out in front of. Somewhere on this beach, not far from here, there was a breakfast. And that simple little breakfast was Jesus' last call to Peter in John 21. You know, I always found it interesting that right after that, Peter was being handed this story. You know, right now you make your own decisions, but one day soon, you're going to have others stretch out your arms. You're going to have people take you where you don't want to go. Another word, especially for those of you from Dayspring, those of you from GCBI, you're not going to believe me, and I wouldn't believe me if I was you. It's going to go a lot faster than you think. Blink, that's 30 years. I'm not kidding. Don't waste your time on yourself. Don't waste your time on yourself. You will never do better by the Lord than when you give up who you are to Him now. One of the principles of God's Word, give me what you got right now and I'll do what I need to do with it and get you what you need to be. I love this passage in John. I could spend a lot of time here. I want you to take a minute. We only have about 2 minutes. I just want you to sit here for a minute. I'm not going to talk at you. I want you to position yourself so you can see something that you will remember, and take 2 minutes and just get an impression of the place of Peter's call, and maybe talk to the Lord about your own. And then we'll quietly get up and go. I love you, Lord, and I lift my voice to worship you. Oh, my soul, rejoice. Take joy, my King, in what you hear. Let it be a sweet, sweet sound in your ear. It's been great being with you at Capernaum, looking at the places where Jesus' ministry began. Matthew called it his hometown, so it certainly was a place embedded in his ministry. Join us next time as we continue exploring the lands of the Bible.